So will the housing market impact the whole economy and all Americans, as Secretary Paulson seems to be warning? We're joined by Charles Payne of WStreet.com, Peter Schiff, president of Euro Pacific Capital, and Pat Powell from Powell Financial Group. We got a real A-team here. Peter Schiff, first you. I think the most frightening thing that Paulson has said today is that the mortgage mess is not just limited to subprimes. He's looking at foreclosures all across the range there.
Of course not. No, it's not just people with bad credit that borrowed money they couldn't afford to repay. You know, everybody who took out an ARM, particularly in the high-priced markets, even the prime borrowers cannot afford the resets. But you know what? It's not going to be just limited to mortgages. Ultimately, this credit crunch is going to extend to all facets of consumer borrowing. It's going to be hard for Americans to borrow money to buy cars, to use their credit cards. And what the government is doing now, what Ben Bernanke is doing, is making this worse. Because by cutting interest rates and letting the dollar fall through the floor, he's basically telling our foreign creditors, who are the ones that are lending us all this money and making mortgages possible in the first place, we're telling them, you're not going to get paid back. The dollar's a bottomless pit. And this is only adding to our problems. If you want to know why oil is $87 a barrel, it's because Ben Bernanke irresponsibly cut interest rates.
All right, but Charles, is the situation really that dire? Yes, in his speech earlier in the day, Paulson talked about the significant risk to the economy of the housing slowdown. But then when I interviewed him, he pointed out that the global economy is strong, and although housing's a risk, that the economy is still okay.
He's taking great pains also to tell us that this is a diversified economy. Our economy is not only the housing market. And, so I obviously totally disagree with Peter. Of course it's a risk. This is sort of an unprecedented point that we have. But you know what? It's not atypical either after the type of run-up that we saw in home prices. Again, if someone had a home that was worth $300,000 6 years ago, ballooned to $700,000 and pulls back to $600,000 or even $500,000, that's about right in terms of how a house should appreciate over a long term. Now, of course, there are some problems that are associated with this. We all know that. We know that there are going to have to be some dramatic things on all fronts, from the lenders, borrowers, and even more from the federal government.
But, Pat, the economy, of course, is more than just housing. But most for most Americans, the house is the main part of their wealth. So it is extremely important in household wealth.
Absolutely. And when you're talking about the individual, they're really concerned. It's that those people who are at the margin, the people who are not quite sure if they're going to be able to make the next mortgage payment, for them, this is a tragedy. For most people who are going to make their mortgage payments, this is not such a big deal.
The overwhelming majority.
The overwhelming majority. But if I can, the guy who can't make it, and I think Paulson alluded to this or even said it in your interview, that the guy who can't make that mortgage payment, instead of just sitting there and letting things collapse around him, needs to take charge. What he needs to do is he needs to call up his banker, and he needs to say, I need to talk to your loan workout group. There are solutions.
They don't want you to go bankrupt. They don't want us.
And that's something Paulson, Secretary Paulson, talked about, that the government is working with these mortgage service companies to make sure that if somebody can make the payments, that they work with them and keep them in their homes.
Well, look, of course they're going to work with them. They don't want to foreclose, but the lenders are going to lose a lot of money. They loan money to people who can't pay it back. But, in Charles's example, where the guy's house goes from $300,000 to $700,000, the problem is last year he refinanced it, and now he has a $650,000 mortgage. So now when the house is only worth $500,000, it's a big deal, especially when he used an ARM, and now the mortgage payment's about to reset, and he can't afford it.
Listen, I got to tell you, this is drastic when we hear about all our fellow Americans who are, in this particular predicament, but it is a drop in the bucket of overall home ownership.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is.
No,
what percentage is it, Peter? What percentage? 5%, 3%? What is it? And here's the bottom line. I do agree with Peter in the sense that it's going to be across the board in terms of the paying, and I think that's where the federal government needs to step in, and Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, they have to buy more expensive loans. You can't keep the threshold of $417,000. Call it a temporary thing if you want, but bring it to $650,000.
Weren't you opposed to that at first when you first heard about it?
Initially, but I think it's the right thing to do at this time. And again, it's not necessarily a bailout, but it's a smart and right thing to do at this time.
Guys, we'll be back. We'll give you more chance to speak on this in a moment. So another day of gushing prices for crude oil, closing at a new high of 87 and 53 cents a barrel.
For months we've been hearing that these high prices would put the brakes on consumer spending, but it really hasn't so far. We're going to ask our panel right now, Peter Schiff, president of Euro Pacific Capital, Pat Powell of the Powell Financial Group, and David Tice, portfolio manager at prudent bear funds. So, David, to you first. Another record today on oil. Does that worry you at all?
Well, it should be worrying people because people have talked about how oil is not that big of a part of GDP, but it's still a very important component of the consumer. And he's driving a bigger car that doesn't get very good gas mileage. Prices are up a lot. This partly due to the U.S. dollar that's been falling off a cliff. And so prices keep going up. We also have a peak oil problem down the road. It's a real concern.
What does this do to corporate profits?
It will hurt corporate profits, for sure. And we think corporate profits are going to slow down because of the slowing U.S. consumer. We think this subprime issue that's spread into other corporate debt, this is the end of a credit bubble. We think this is huge. Their structured finance is no longer trusted.
Pat, what did Paulson tell you today that gave you a hint one way or the other how the economy might be going? Because he has access to a lot of data that the rest of us don't.
Yeah, he seemed a bit nervous about the economy, to say the least. So I'm sort of reading between the lines because he's not that concerned because he's not stepping in. All right, he basically still said, let the free markets work their way through this. And I think that when you look at that, it's always the free markets that are the most efficient and the cheapest way to work through anything.
When you look at the market today, does that tell you that, in fact, the free markets are sort of digesting his news without panicking?
Yeah, I actually think that they're focused a little bit more about what's going on in the Mideast. I think they're looking at what's going on in Turkey. I think there's immediate pop when the Turkish Parliament passed a resolution, or was trying to pass a resolution to go into Iraq after the Kurdish rebels. So I think there's a real political risk here, and I don't want to confuse the two.
Well, Peter Schiff, over to you. We were looking at some comments by OPEC. More demand, less supply. Does that concern you at all?
Well, sure, it concerns me, but I mean, I own a lot of oil, so I'm benefiting from it. But the more inflation the Fed creates, the higher oil prices are going to go. We can't give OPEC debased dollars and expect them to keep selling it to us for the same price. And when David talked about the fact that oil is a smaller part of our GDP, the only reason for that is all the products that we used to manufacture ourselves, we now import. So oil is still important. It's just that we don't see it in oil. We see it in the price of the consumer goods we import.
Well, David was actually agreeing with you, I think. He was saying that oil is still important, even though we don't have the big companies that use so much of it.
I was just elaborating on why. I mean, why it's a smaller part of our economy. Because our economy is no longer manufacturing. We're consuming and importing. But we're still going to feel it. And you know what's going to send oil prices north of $150 a barrel?
$150 a barrel?
It's going to be when the Chinese government comes to its senses and stops suppressing the value of their own currency, lets the free market set the exchange rate of the yuan. When that happens, the yuan is going to gain dramatically. So will currencies throughout Asia. And then oil prices for the Asians will drop sharply, causing an explosion in demand for energy in Asia, at the same time sending the U.S. dollar price of oil through the roof.
All right.
Did you hear 150? I don't know if everybody here would agree with that.
Checking my hearing just a second. David, here's where we are. Up $1.48 today, 87.61 for a barrel of crude. We've got inventory data coming out this week. You think that's going to be a further push for oil prices to go higher?
I'm not on top of the inventory number, Dagan, right now, but I do believe that we have a longer-term supply problem, and as Peter said, we have a currency problem. And currency is being debased, and therefore the price to the U.S. consumer and to America is going to go up. And I can't argue with Peter's statement about down the road being $150.
By the way, Dagan was...
Oh, that was Cheryl, by the way.
This is Cheryl.
David gets to hang out with all the women at the Fox Business Network, just so you know.
I apologize.
There's a basic tenet of economics, and that is the cure for high prices is high prices. And the cure for
what
high
do you mean by that?
The cure for high oil prices is high oil prices. As the price goes up, we have to make other decisions. Businesses are making them first. Individuals, it takes longer. The average car on our road is 8.9 years old. It's going to take a long time to replace that with fuel-efficient cars. It's not going to happen overnight.
Well, and also, Pat, people keep driving, though. I mean, we see this every summer. People bellyache about gas prices, then they drive anyway. It doesn't change anything.
They do, but they're still driving the car that they bought 3-4 years ago. And what we're talking about is, on your next car, maybe you're going to go and give a Prius a test drive. Maybe you won't buy it, but you're going to at least give it a try.
Could it make Anwar a little more desirable place to drill, Peter?
Well, a big part of the problem, though, is that oil prices aren't really rising so much as the value of money is falling. So oil is not getting more expensive. Our money is becoming less valuable. So you're not going to get that big increase of supply or reduction in demand. Ultimately, what's going to kill demand in the United States is going to be Americans who are not going to be able to afford to borrow any more money. I mean, we're putting all this oil on our charge cards. We've been borrowing out of our homes. We're not going to be able to do that. The rest of the world isn't going to loan us money to buy oil. They're going to buy the oil themselves.
All right, guys, we're going to have you back in just a moment.
All right,
Well, so how about it? How big a mess is the housing crisis, and is the bailout worked out by some of the nation's biggest banks going to be enough?
we're joined again by our panel, Peter Schiff, president of Euro Pacific Capital, Pat Powell of Powell Financial Group, and, of course, David Tice, portfolio manager at Prudent Bear Funds. So David, I'm sure you heard the Secretary's comments today. It was a very alarmist speech he gave this morning.
Well, Paulson has got to be careful not to be too Pollyannish here, and he can't, because we think things are going to get worse, and he has to maintain some credibility down the road when things do get worse, and he can't come out and say everything's fine when it's not going to be fine.
Has he been doing that?
Well, I think he's been a little bit too Pollyannish before, and now he's getting a little bit more austere, and I think that's probably
appropriate. But is there a danger of swinging too much the other way?
Potentially, but it depends on how bad it gets, and he's certainly looking at things, and it's not pretty out there. The credit markets are still in disarray. There's still a big problem in structured finance, and housing is still in steep decline. It's still tough to get a jumbo mortgage. It's going to be tough.
Well, then, Pat, why did these banks come out yesterday and decide to take a gamble on mortgage-backed securities?
I don't think they have a choice. I really don't. I think they're stuck with. A lot of them have the portfolio. They've had their fingers in these pies for a very long time. They were on automatic pilot. They weren't doing what bankers usually do, and that is looking at loans. The securities industry securitized everything, so the original bank maybe who gave the loan, it ended up eventually into the open market, and there's all kinds of people that are owning these have no idea what they've actually purchased.
Were they in danger of going broke? Some people have suggested that they had become decapitalized, and if there had been a run on a bank, they wouldn't have had the cash.
Well, earnings are down, but they're not negative, and these are pretty well diversified banks. I think you're probably referring to the Citigroup,
which you own some.
I own some Citigroup, and real unhappy with the situation. But they have not been doing what bankers normally do, and there's going to be a price to pay, and the price is going to be they're going to have to work this through. It's not in their best interest to foreclose on loans. It is not in their best interest to throw people out on the streets. Every bank has a loan workout group, and what you do is they work with businesses, they work with consumers who have trouble trying to find ways to make something work. And I think anyone out there who's in trouble, this is where you go to start.
All right, so Peter, over to you. The word bailout keeps getting tossed back and forth. Is the government bailing people out, or is this just letting the free markets work? These people signed these documents. They signed them.
Yeah, first of all, no one's going to get thrown out in the streets. There are plenty of houses to rent. I know. I'm renting one myself. All that's going to happen to people who can't make their mortgage payments, if they can't renegotiate with a bank, they'll go rent something they can afford. Most of these people bought with nothing down, so what do they got to lose? Or if they put something down, they extracted it in a home equity refinance. It's the creditors who are going to lose, and the government needs to stay out of it. But the bigger thing is people are underestimating the impact on the economy from the bursting of the housing bubble. When these mortgages reset, it's not that people have a lot of a slush fund out there to pay these higher mortgage payments. Even if they can afford it, it's going to come at a complete collapse of discretionary consumer spending.
Well, Peter, let's talk about the long-term picture, though, because, look, the subprime business is dead. Gone.
Of course.
There's no more of these borrowers out there.
It never should have existed in the first place, and it wouldn't have existed if Alan Greenspan didn't keep interest rates so low, and if foreign central banks and other foreigners didn't have so many dollars that they earned by selling us products that we couldn't afford. They're the ones that bought all this securitized crap in the first place.
There's a place for subprime lending, and I would differ vehemently on this issue. There are a lot of people that are in a house today because of subprime lending.
And
now, not everybody.
Hold on a second, Peter.
Not everybody's going to make it, but the vast majority of these people are making timely payments on their mortgages, and that's the only way that they got into a house. Home ownership.
By the way, you say vast majority. Hold on, Peter. You say vast majority. What percent are in the foreclosure stage?
foreclosure, I don't have the exact figure, but some form of default or behind is about 14, 15%.
Peter, go ahead.
If you can't save up 20%, if you can't afford a fully amortized mortgage, you've got no business buying a house. You should rent. There's nothing wrong with renting.
That's one theory of lending. There's another
not a theory.
That's a theory of lending. There are asset-based lenders, and then there are lenders that will lend on income.
Well,
and some of them got carried away. I agree that there's a problem in subprime lending, but I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are many people who are in their homes because this market actually existed, and creditors took a risk, and they should pay for the risk if they misstaged it.
Peter?
Well, I agree. Creditors are going to pay. But, you know, homeowners, what's going to change is these fantasies of instant wealth by owning homes. You know, we created a whole nation of speculators. People thought real estate prices were going to go up forever. So they committed to mortgages they knew they couldn't afford because they thought they were going to get rich. And now that, you know, they realize that they bought into a bill of goods, just like they did with the dot-coms, you know, we're going to pay the consequences.
Want to get in the middle of this?
Yeah, I agree with what Peter said, and agree that the financiers got too aggressive. They lent too much money to people just because they were trying to get a fee. And the problem was structured finance, where you didn't have a banker that sat across a table from someone that held that loan. Instead, somebody was making a loan. It was securitized. They didn't really care. Therefore, they fudged the numbers, the income numbers, the collateral numbers, etc. That's the big problem.
But what all this means is we're going to get more regulation, right?
I hope not. I hope you let the free markets work it out. The free markets will do it at the most efficient and cheapest way.
Already Senator Schumer and others have come in with suggestions. Go ahead, Peter.
But it also means we're going to get much, much lower home prices, because the only reason real estate prices got to these ridiculous levels was because of these crazy lending standards. Once they go away, the artificial home prices that they supported are going to go away. And people are going to have to get used to seeing their houses 30 or 40 or 50% less than what they think they're worth.
All right, we're going to leave it there, David, Peter, Pat. Thanks to all of you. Appreciate it.
Well, phone companies hang up on Congress saying they're not going to tell congressional leaders how they participated in that international spying program.
So how long will they be able to hold out? That's next on Fox Business.
The biggest telephone companies are being dead silent about their role in helping the government monitor overseas phone calls to or from suspected terrorists.
Officials from AT&T, Verizon, and Qwest are refusing to answer questions from the House Energy and Commerce Committee about their role in helping the administration with warrantless wiretaps. Are they being patriotic or betraying their customers? Let's turn to our Fox panel. Peter Schiff of Euro Pacific Capital once again with us, and Charles Payne is here of WStreet.com. Charles, to you first. This is a crazy position that these companies are in. They're in the middle of a fight. Is this the right question to ask them to turn over this information?
I think it's absolutely wrong. I mean, listen, we're at war right now. We're at war abroad. We're at war at home. And there are extraordinary things that you do at war. In fact, it's in several different laws, including the Patriot Act, which last year was renewed 89-10 in the Senate. So, you know, I consider the phone companies to be patriots at this point. Listen. Just think of all the ways we could have stopped 9/11 if we'd been paying attention and connecting the dots. We have to do that now because we know there's a lot of plots against us at this moment.
Like, for example?
Like right here. Look at today's newspaper. Look at this. Terror on a tarmac. It's all around us. It's in our midst. If we're not proactive in this, we're going to be crying in our milk again.
Well, Peter, it sounds like some private businesses have been very proactive in helping out the government. Is there anything wrong with that?
Well, look, I think that the Constitution and individual privacy is more important than the government's need to gather intelligence. You know, I mean, you had Ron Paul on here earlier. He's one of the few people that talked against the Patriot Act. I mean, that was a terrible bill to have passed. I mean, we as Americans, unfortunately, we suffer much greater threats to our liberties from our own government than from foreign terrorists.
But, Peter, these companies were just following what they were asked to do by the president. I mean, at what point are they at fault here? Because they're being put on the spot.
If they have specific reason to believe a specific conversation, they can go to a judge and get a warrant. To just go on a fishing expedition and say, I want all the information from all the telephone calls that you have, and we don't know what the government's going to do with that information. There's nothing that says that they can only use it for terrorists. You know, you don't want the government to be gathering all kinds of information on its citizens that it can use against us.
You say if they have specific threats. How do you get specific threats unless you can see a certain pattern? I mean, I don't understand it. So they're going to just guess at specific threats? Look at the headlines, Peter. You're not paying attention. Americans.
Sure I am.
You have the greatest liberties in the world. You can go nowhere else I can think of and put down a country and a government and the people the way that you do on a weekly basis.
Look,
you and the Bill Maher's of the world, you want your freedoms and you have them, but you don't understand what it takes to keep them.
Look, Charles, you don't have to keep attacking my patriotism because I disagree with you on what's going to happen to the stock market or the dollar, or if I disagree.
It's that you're so negative on America in general, and I think that it's so wrong. And I think part of that whole thing with you and others is like, you know what, maybe if we say it enough, people will believe it, and it becomes self-fulfilling. So to a certain degree, I am offended. Yes.
Sure. I've been negative on the U.S. dollar. I've been negative on U.S. dollar-denominated financial assets. And to my clients' benefit, you know, they've made a lot of money because I've been correctly.
A lot of people made money in the U.S. stock market
as well. No, they haven't.
Yes,
Charles,
of course they have.
Did you
I don't want to get into that with you because I want to stick with this topic about the fact of the matter is, listen, what do you think we should do to protect ourselves?
Look,
I think we just counterpunch.
We should protect. Question. Go ahead, Peter.
We should protect our constitutional liberties, our rights to privacy, and try to fight the war on terror. But we can't sacrifice the Constitution in order to do it. Otherwise, what are we fighting for?
We're not sacrificing the Constitution. The government was looking at phone bills for records and trends. Who's calling the Middle East? Who may be calling the hills in Pakistan? You know, we're looking for specific things to head off disaster.
Yeah, and
I can't see
you
why
don't know
that is
how
such
the
a
government is going to use.
Well, you know what? That's the way they told me they're doing it, and I want to believe them. I'm not like you. I don't distrust everything the government does.
Well, this country was founded by people who distrusted government. That's why we have a Constitution.
They distrusted a bad government with the king and unfair taxes.
They distrusted this government. They said it was a necessary evil. The Constitution is written to protect.
We created this Congress. You know, this is fifth grade social studies. We know how this country was created, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to protect. You can't have liberties if your people are lying in the street dead because we couldn't stop a suicide bomber who was making phone calls to his buddies every day.
Charles, most of our liberties have been lost during wartime. The greatest amount of threats to our personal liberties have come with what governments have done. You know, we wouldn't even have an income tax today if it wasn't for the Second World War. That started as a victory tax.
Listen, I'm talking about here and now, Peter, and guess what? The greatest thing in the world is that you have the right to say what you're saying on national television because of this country and this Constitution.
By the way, just a point of order here. The income tax was started, as I remember, back before the First World War.
But nobody paid it. Nobody paid it until 1942.
Some people paid it. It was a small. In wartime, you always pay taxes. In fact, Abraham Lincoln imposed a tax. As you say, war times call for some awful measures.
Yes,
some of which impugn on our liberties.
But
if we didn't take those measures, what would happen, Peter?
Well, the problem is after the war is over, they never surrender the tax. The inheritance tax, the estate tax, all these taxes.
Our taxes are a lot lower now than they were right after World War II, by the way. We have the ability, because it's a democracy, to lower taxes from time to time.
You're wrong on that. The rates are lower. No, the rates are lower.
But the rates are a lot lower.
But people pay more in taxes. The amount of the U.S. economy that is consumed by government is much higher than it was at the end of the Second World War.
Do you know what percent of GDP went to pay for the Defense Department during World War II? It was 50% of GDP. Do you know how much it is now? It's about 6% of GDP. So you're wrong.
After the war.
You're wrong.
After the war.
Right. It took a long time for that to come down to the current levels.
Listen, the bottom line, too, is
I don't mean to get into Charles's side here. I'm not defending Charles. I'm just pointing out some things that happen to be true.
Our current Constitution replaced a prior Constitution that didn't have the ability to tax and raise an army and defend itself.
But at least, you know, we paid for World War II legitimately. We financed it internally. We're paying for the war on terror by borrowing from the Chinese and borrowing from the Japanese and the Saudis. You know, we're not raising taxes, but we're going into debt.
No,
does that concern you, Charles?
That we're going into debt? I think we have a really balanced system. I'm a little concerned about consumer debt, but I think the system works. And I think this fear-mongering thing, it does play a role into people sort of, again, becoming
But don't you appreciate and even admire some of the principles of people like Peter or Ron Paul, for example, who are saying that the best government is the one that governs least?
Obviously, I like a less government. I'm not, big government, big Democrat government. I do like less government, but there's a place or a tipping point where we need some sort of authority figure, some sort of organization, when that comes from the government.
All right, you guys, we got to leave it there, but great debate. David Asman, wow. All right.